A personal view of one of the greatest ever Britons.
We will always face crises. Crises that call for true leaders. Crises in which our leaders are tested to the full. When their decisions make the difference between failure and success, defeat and victory. But one man above all others remains the model for the crisis leader. The man who saw Britain through her darkest hour. Winston Churchill.
In this programme, I'm going to reveal to you the leadership techniques that Churchill used to avert a Nazi invasion. But I'm also going to tell you the surprising story of Churchill's leadership in the first months of the war, before he became Prime Minister. It's an object lesson in how not to lead. It's a story with an extraordinary twist. What you'll learn is how it was possible for a man to be a disastrous leader one month, and yet a national saviour the next.
The fateful hour of 11 has struck, and Britain's final warning to Hitler having been ignored, a state of war once more exists between Great Britain and Germany. Following the declaration of war, Mr. Churchill, as in 1914, is First Lord of the Admiralty.
It's easily forgotten that for the first 8 months of the war, Churchill was not Prime Minister, that he was in fact in charge of the Navy here at the Admiralty. And it was while he was based here that he made a number of crucial errors, even blunders.
As First Lord, it was Churchill's job to ensure the safe arrival of Britain's convoys of merchant ships. But they were being hunted down by a dangerous and elusive enemy, the U-boat. Churchill's immediate attempt to tackle this menace completely backfired. His mistake was in not listening to what key experts at the Admiralty were saying. They suggested that all available warships stay and defend these convoys of merchant vessels. But this wasn't Churchill's style. He wanted to go on the offensive, actively seeking out and attacking the U-boats with packs of destroyers. But finding them in the vast seas was no easy task. The merchant ships, meanwhile, were left with inadequate protection.
Why are the ships always sinking and blinking at sea? What makes the British start thinking of their cup of tea? It's now the season, the reason, explain what it means. German submarine. What thinks the
Churchill's tactic was laudably proactive, but the only side to benefit was the wrong one.
It's now the season, the reason, explain what it means. German submarine.
But Churchill wanted to persuade the British public that the Royal Navy was on top of the U-boat threat. He wanted them to know what a fine job he was doing in protecting them. What he did next was what we've come to expect from most politicians, but not from the statesman consistently voted the greatest leader of the 20th century.
Churchill knew full well that only 9 of Germany's 57 U-boats were thought to have been sunk.
We feel ourselves more confident day by day of our ability.
But in a broadcast to the nation, the First Lord of the Admiralty painted a very different picture.
It seems pretty certain tonight that half the U-boats with which Germany began the war have been sunk.
half the U-boats was a blatant lie. Outrageous, even by the standards of wartime propaganda. Churchill's creativity with the statistics was challenged by the director of anti-submarine warfare, Captain Arthur Talbot. So Churchill wrote to the First Sea Lord,
"It might be a good thing if Captain Talbot goes to sea as soon as possible."
The Royal Navy's chief expert on U-boat warfare was duly removed.
This utterly ruthless and arbitrary behaviour doesn't fit the image most of us have of Winston Churchill. The fact is, few of us would want to work for a boss who'd remove someone just for pointing out an obvious error, or for someone who so blatantly manipulates the statistics to suit their own ends.
While Churchill's goal, no doubt, was to boost public morale, his failed strategizing, blatant lying, and ruthless behavior only ostracized him from his close colleagues. But Churchill by no means confined himself to Admiralty matters. Far from it.
2 chord go 15-3.
He got involved in some very surprising, totally non-naval affairs.
Tilapia goes 8.7.
The Parliamentary Secretary to the Admiralty, Geoffrey Shakespeare, arrived at his office one morning to find an extraordinary request from Churchill.
"I am concerned about the shortage of fish. Parliamentary Secretary will immediately take up the matter to see if trawlers can be released for fishing. We must have a policy of utmost fish."
More, I think.
The size of the trawlerman's catch was the responsibility of the Ministry of Agriculture and Fisheries. It was none of Churchill's business. But the utmost fish request was only one of numerous examples of Churchill's interference in matters beyond his responsibility. He also bombarded his cabinet colleagues with a barrage of memos on issues far removed from Admiralty business. He happily criticised the Lord Privy Seal over food rationing, fuel restrictions and blackouts. It comes as a great surprise to most people to discover just how flawed Churchill's leadership was while he was at the Admiralty. But poor leadership is not devoid of lessons, not least because it clearly illustrates what not to do. Don't dismiss the advice of your experts. Don't sack people just for voicing criticism. And don't obsessively meddle in other people's business, to give but 3 obvious examples. What's clearest of all is that Churchill was the very worst kind of person to have as a subordinate. He'd already made a number of mistakes at the Admiralty, though fortunately none with very serious consequences. At least so far, he hadn't been responsible for any catastrophic military blunders. On the 7th of April 1940, a British reconnaissance aircraft made an important sighting. German warships were heading towards Norway. It was soon clear that they were part of an audacious plan by Hitler to invade the neutral country. Despite Norwegian resistance, the bold and efficient German assault quickly brought much of the country under Nazi control. The absence of Allied opposition in the air and on the seas enabled the Germans to consolidate their position. But Churchill still had the chance to prove that both he and the Royal Navy were up to the challenge. The outcome of the Norway campaign would now very largely depend upon his leadership. Churchill was confident,
prophesying that the British would, in his words, liquidate the German forces in a week or two. Was this then the moment when he would win a decisive victory and establish his claim to become Prime Minister?
But Churchill's leadership style didn't further the Allied cause. He interfered constantly, dictating military strategy from Whitehall, an approach that frustrated his colleagues. Churchill also altered his plans so many times in 1 week that for the men at sea there was total confusion. When the Navy finally did land troops in Norway, Churchill's last-minute changes meant that many of them had been separated from their equipment. The Allies came under increasing pressure. Indecisive, interfering leadership carried out miles from the scene of action played no small part in the faltering of the campaign. By May, the demoralised army was being ferried home. The Germans had won an outright victory. The Norwegians were left to their fate under their new occupiers. The world's greatest navy was in retreat, chased all the way home by the German Air Force. The man ultimately responsible for the disaster was Winston Churchill. It's one of the great ironies of history that it was the fiasco in Norway that forced Chamberlain to resign and made Churchill Prime Minister. After all, it was Churchill who bore far more responsibility for the conduct of the campaign. So why was it that Churchill, whose record at the Admiralty had been far from brilliant and had ended in disaster, was now a contender for the premiership? Surprisingly, the answer lies in the years when he'd not held office at all. Churchill was in political exile for most of the 1930s. He spent much of his time during these wilderness years at his home Chartwell in Kent. He turned his enormous energy to a variety of projects. But he also kept busy proclaiming his views on his various hobby horses, including the question of self-government for India, something of which he deeply disapproved.
Things are going from bad to worse. Great mismanagement and weakness are causing unrest and disturbance to 300 million primitive people whose well-being is in our care. For I feel that the Indian danger...
But few agreed with his old-fashioned opinions on the responsibilities of empire. His views distanced him from the political mainstream.
Churchill was out of tune with the times, disliked and mistrusted by those who did not share his opinions. But what made him especially unpopular in these wilderness years were his views on Nazi Germany. From 1933, Churchill had identified the threat posed to Britain by Hitler. And although few wanted to listen to his message, he constantly proclaimed the urgent need to rearm.
The only choice open is the old grim choice whether we shall submit or whether we prepare.
He wrote a vast number of articles on this theme. While some people in Britain admired Hitler, Churchill saw him for what he really was, a fascist warmonger. In 1935, he warned of Germany's secret rearmament. Since Hitler had come to power, he wrote, the country's whole energies had been directed to war.
There dwells a nation of nearly 70 million who are being taught from childhood to think of war as a glorious exercise, and death in battle as the noblest fate for man.
Der Nationalsozialismus ist keine Lehre des Glücks, des Zufalls, sondern eine Lehre der Arbeit, eine Lehre des Ringens und damit auch eine Lehre der Opfer.
Churchill's views about Germany were shared by few in the political establishment, most of whom supported the government's policy of appeasing the Nazis. But Churchill refused to accept the consensus. This tenacity, even obstinacy, marked Churchill out from the other politicians who, then as now, tended to go with the zeitgeist. It's normally the surest way to ruin a political career.
But events had unfolded much as Churchill had been warning since 1933. Germany's Führer was a ruthless expansionist, exactly as Churchill had predicted. He had been secretly rearming, bent on subjecting the whole of Europe to life under Nazi rule, just as Churchill had foreseen.
Hitler's invasion of Czechoslovakia in 1939 had shown that he had been right about the Nazis all along. Churchill became Prime Minister not for what he had done in office, least of all at the Admiralty, but for the views he held when he was out of office, during the wilderness years. What he had was credibility, while almost every other senior political figure had been compromised by their support for appeasement. Churchill, the man who had been written off by most as a failure and has-been, pulled off the greatest leadership coup in British history.
How do you do, Mr. Right? Can it be true?
On the 10th of May 1940, Winston Churchill finally made it to number 10 Downing Street.
For a four-leaf clover out of the blue, Mr. Right.
The very same day that Churchill took up his new post, Hitler unleashed his Blitzkrieg offensive in the West. The German army swept across northern France. Soon, they were nearing the Channel coast. The French and the British armies were trapped at Dunkirk. It was a dire situation. Certainly not one you'd expect a leader with Churchill's recent track record to survive. But Churchill was no longer a subordinate in charge of the Navy. He was now the Prime Minister, the man in ultimate charge. And in taking on this new role, Churchill managed to turn many of his former weaknesses into great strengths. His obstinacy, his ruthlessness, his unabashed urge to speak directly to the people, his desire for action over inertia. These were no longer drawbacks, but huge assets. And the transformation could not have been more timely. Under constant German pressure, it seemed certain that the whole Allied army would be lost. But Dunkirk was held long enough for many to escape by ship. When the Germans did finally break through, they found that the Allies had abandoned enormous quantities of military equipment. They had left behind vehicles and weapons they could ill afford to lose. All that separated the undefeated Germans from yet another victory was the narrow English Channel.
Britain had not been so vulnerable to invasion since the days of Napoleon. Within 3 weeks of becoming Prime Minister, Churchill's leadership was put to the ultimate test. And this is where he finally proved, after so many setbacks and failures, what an exemplary leader he could be. His immediate response would be crucial.
a miracle of deliverance achieved by valor, by perseverance, by perfect discipline, by faultless service, by resource, by skill, by unconquerable fidelity, is manifest to us all. Sir, we must be very careful not to assign to this deliverance the attributes of a victory. Wars are not won by evacuation.
Churchill's total honesty about Dunkirk won his listeners' trust. But he also used his rhetoric to inspire the British people to come to terms with their predicament and to encourage them to fight on.
Sir, I have myself full confidence that if all do their duty, if nothing is neglected, and if the best arrangements are made, as they are being made, we shall prove ourselves once more able to defend our island home, to ride out the storm of war, and to outlive the menace of tyranny, if necessary for years.
We all know the climax to his speech. We shall fight on the beaches. We shall fight on the landing grounds.
We shall fight in the fields and in the streets. We shall fight in the hills. We shall never surrender.
Because those words are so famous, it's often overlooked what made them so effective. By telling the British people how heroic they were going to be, he gave them no choice but to play out the parts in the script he had written, or be shamed.
In the aftermath of the September the 11th terrorist attacks, Americans faced their own crisis. When searching for words to unite American resolve, it was to Churchill that the president turned.
We will rally the world to this cause by our efforts, by our courage. We will not tire, we will not falter, and we will not fail.
We shall not fail or falter. We shall not weaken or tire.
Never in the field of human conflict,
said the Washington Post,
was so much owed by so many to the words of Winston Churchill.
These demands are not open to negotiation or discussion.
Churchill's decision to fight on gained widespread support. But some had thought his military approach unnecessarily dangerous, including a member of his own war cabinet. Lord Halifax, the Foreign Secretary, had considered negotiating peace with Hitler to be the pragmatic solution. But in a series of cabinet meetings, Churchill stubbornly stood his ground and finally persuaded him that fighting on was the only option.
It was one of the most decisive moments in the history of Western civilization. During the spring of 1940, Churchill's obstinacy, his desire not to take what appeared to be the easy way out, transformed him from being a pig-headed politician into a world statesman. Churchill outmaneuvered the appeasers in his government. He would never make peace with Hitler.
Nazi plans for an invasion of Britain were soon underway. The Prime Minister knew that his role in what would follow would be the crucial one. He had to do everything he could to position himself as the living embodiment of resistance to the Nazis. In short, he needed to project his own image.
In an inspection of southern and eastern defense zones. Typifying Britain's iron determination to destroy the blight of Nazism, the Prime Minister takes a keen interest in new military preparations. Truly, his unflinching and inspiring energy makes him John Bull #1.
Every week, as many as 20 million cinema goers saw the Prime Minister in newsreel on the silver screen.
What do you get out of living?
Churchill nurtured his bulldog image, playing to the crowds who adored him and the newsreel photographers who followed him.
Are you getting any loving?
Churchill did what remains crucial for every leader in times of peril. He made himself a figurehead. In fact, he came to personify the solution to the crisis that faced the nation. And he played out the part like an actor, deliberately employing distinctive props.
Who is that man with the big cigar? He's here, he's there, he's everywhere, that man with the big cigar.
He also recognized the power of certain gestures, especially his famous V for Victory sign, interpreted by many as a cheeky up yours to Adolf Hitler. Another trademark was waving his hat on his cane.
That Churchill even managed to turn his walking stick, something usually associated with infirmity, into a symbol of strength says much for his force of personality. It reminds me of another great British Prime Minister.
Margaret Thatcher's trademark was another object rarely associated with strength: her handbag. It helped her with the image she was trying to project in opposition, that of the sensible female leader. A woman who would introduce prudent housekeeping into the economy.
Nothing special. Well, when you're shopping, they always talk to you about prices, often about tax, and they usually say something like it can't go on like this.
Once she became Prime Minister, her trademark came to represent something else, and the verb to handbag, meaning a female politician's attack on a male opponent or colleague, entered the political dictionary. It's telling that when these two leaders were immortalized as statues, both were holding their respective trademarks. Oratory and image are crucial tools for any leader, but no one can go it alone. They need the trust and active support of their colleagues and subordinates.
Having spent a lifetime taunting his political opponents in all the major parties, Churchill now desperately needed their help. So how was he going to win over people who until recently had despised him? One of his greatest heroes had shown how it could be done.
Although he wasn't British and had governed during a very different kind of crisis, there was a key lesson to be learned from President Abraham Lincoln. During the American Civil War, Lincoln had faced opposition not only from the breakaway states, but from within his own camp too. So he included all his most outspoken critics from both parties in his cabinet. It was a tactic that enabled the president to get on with successfully fighting the war.
And we march along together as we sing with all our might.
It was a tactic that had not gone unnoticed by Churchill. He said,
"Let pre-war feuds die. Let personal quarrels be forgotten. And let us keep our hatred for the common enemy."
He was as good as his word. He included in his war cabinet not only the Tory Prime Minister he deposed, Neville Chamberlain, but also the leaders of the Labour opposition, Clement Attlee and Arthur Greenwood.
Churchill, like Lincoln, understood that a crisis is the ideal time to join your rivals to the common cause. That way, a leader can claim to speak for everyone, and energy previously wasted is channeled into tackling the crisis.
While Churchill secured the support of his former enemies, like most leaders, he rewarded loyal friends and allies.
Another appointment indicative of renewed vigour is that of Mr. Duff Cooper to the Ministry of Information. Behind every appointment will be the personality of Mr. Churchill.
Time will come before
But Cooper fell out with the press. They ran a series of attacks on him, focusing on what they dubbed Cooper's snoopers, government informants who reported on public morale. One paper held a ballot on whether he should keep his job.
But Churchill didn't need a ballot. He'd shown at the Admiralty how ruthless he could be with his staff. Now he proved just how cutthroat he could be with his friends.
Duff Cooper's departure from the Ministry of Information for a somewhat mysterious mission in Singapore.
Duff Cooper was stripped of his job and sent on a mission to the Far East. Churchill was fulfilling the first requirement of any successful Prime Minister, to be a good butcher. In fact, it's true of any leader.
And you look at that bottom 10, and we can't carry the bottom 10. We got to keep, who said it today here, raising the bar?
Jack Welch, former CEO of General Electric, has gone down in corporate history not only as businessman of the 20th century, but also as Neutron Jack. Because, like the neutron bomb, he got rid of people but left everything else intact. Within 5 years of his arrival at GE, 81,000 staff had been made redundant. But Welch didn't fire people just to cut costs. He did it to streamline a massive bureaucracy that had paralysed decision-making. Under Welch's ruthless leadership, GE became the company with the highest market value in the world. Churchill despaired at the collective decision-making process that had crippled the British war effort under Chamberlain.
Chatterbox, 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 talking all day long.
In war, Churchill recognised, decisions need to be made quickly. Not, as he had once complained,
settled for the greatest number, by the common sense of most, after the consultation of all.
Churchill radically downsized the War Cabinet from 9 members to just 5, so that decisions could be made more effectively. But he didn't stop there. He abolished the Military Coordination Committee and created a new position for himself, Minister of Defence. The Chiefs of Staff now reported directly to him.
Not since Oliver Cromwell had one man wielded so much power in Britain. But wouldn't this concentration of authority make Churchill dangerous? He'd shown at the Admiralty that he was prone to meddle. He now had the right to interfere in any military matter he chose. It might prove catastrophic.
What compounded the problem was that Churchill had actually been a soldier himself. He had attended the Royal Military College at Sandhurst, and during 15 years of service saw action across much of the British Empire. This varied army career only increased the temptation to play the military strategist. But fortunately, Churchill seems to have learned a lesson from his experience in charge of the Navy. Despite his inclination and past performance, in the battle that lay ahead, he did not interfere in a way he previously had done. Instead, he gave his subordinates a chance. As we shall see, he was scarcely hands-off. That was not in Churchill's nature. Instead, he found a way to interfere constructively. It was a change in leadership style that came only just in time for the fortunes of this country. For the decisive Battle of Britain was now about to start.
Eine Ju-88, der modernste Horizontal- und Sturzkampfbomber, wird klar zum Start gemacht.
The Luftwaffe was charged with paving the way for the invasion. They would bomb Britain's defences and destroy her air force. But Churchill didn't take it upon himself to organise Britain's aerial defences. Instead, he left it to the head of Fighter Command, Air Chief Marshal Sir Hugh Dowding. Dowding, Churchill had come to realise, didn't need to be told how to do his job. What he did need was more fighters, planes to replace Fighter Command's heavy losses. Churchill responded by creating a new post, Minister of Aircraft Production. But he didn't give it to a regular politician. He looked instead to the home of the newspaper industry, to the head of Express newspapers, who ruled his empire from the most modern building on Fleet Street. Lord Beaverbrook was a successful businessman. But would he have the skills necessary to succeed in his crucial government role? Aircraft production had not yet been rationalised. A radical change was needed. Beaverbrook had transformed the Daily Express from a loss maker into a money spinner with the highest circulation in the world. He tackled his new role with the same dynamism, ruthlessly removing any obstacle to raising short-term production.
Beaverbrook sliced through the bureaucracy. He didn't waste a minute. Visitors to his office weren't even offered a chair. His approach was energetic and direct.
In the defenses of Britain, be the hour when we can say, we have provided you with what you require.
Beaverbrook bullied his team and hogged scarce resources. Over the summer, fighter production rose by 50%. George Bush Jr. took a leaf out of Churchill's book when he appointed Donald Rumsfeld as his Secretary of Defense. Rumsfeld, like Beaverbrook, was selected from outside the conventional political gene pool. He had once been a politician, but then spent many years as a successful CEO. Rumsfeld brought to the Pentagon a dogged personal style and an often unpolitical way of doing things. He doesn't skirt around issues in the hope of appearing likeable. He goes on the attack with a cranky frankness, whether reforming the military, reorganizing America's defenses, or prosecuting the war on terror. Churchill's instinct to appoint an outsider had proved wise. But Beaverbrook's success created another problem for the Prime Minister. Now, there weren't enough pilots. Training men to fly fighters takes time, a luxury that was not available in the summer of 1940. Pilots were being killed quicker than they could be replaced. New planes were of little use with no one to fly them. During the summer, Churchill continually visited fighter bases. His main concern was solving this manpower shortage. He was employing a technique that today's leadership gurus call MBWA, management by walking about. It involves looking at things for yourself and listening to the people at ground level. It was during just such a walkabout that Churchill identified for himself one of the reasons for the pilot shortage. There were, he wrote to the Air Ministry, an enormous number of pilots in non-combat roles. He was right. Out of 10 pilots with wings, only 3 were flying planes. He urged the ministry to intensify its search for operational flyers. In his words,
to comb out the fluff and flummery.
Visiting another aerodrome, Churchill saw gaping bomb craters in the runway. He pressed for a better system to ensure that they were filled in fast. He was determined to get the fighters turned around quickly.
He's a grand old man, never was an also ran.
One pilot told Churchill that there was a delay during refueling.
Wearing the famous bulldog grin and smoking a big cigar.
The real bottleneck, Churchill discovered, was actually during rearming. He made sure the problem was swiftly addressed. Having witnessed the problems at first hand and taken the advice of the men on the spot, Churchill exerted his unique authority to force through solutions. This attention to detail was not the irritating trait it had been at the Admiralty, where he had tried to interfere from Whitehall. His hands-on leadership technique was now an essential element of his warcraft, a tool for national survival. Churchill's technique of management by walking about was also practiced by one of America's most successful businessmen, Walmart founder Sam Walton.
If a customer comes with that 10 feet of me, I'm going to look him in the eye, and freedom. So help me sing.
In fact, Walton flew from store to store to consult with his employees.
Yeah, taking up to take care of it. Okay. Thank you for coming in. It means I like it. You like it too, don't you?
It wasn't just a gimmick. He learned what needed fixing. His methods were very effective. They made him the undisputed merchant king of the late 20th century and one of the richest men in the world. August 1940 saw Churchill's leadership face another test. Hitler had ordered his Luftwaffe to intensify their bombing campaign as preparation for his invasion. He instructed his air force to destroy the RAF in the air and on the ground, while taking care to avoid damage to civilian centres. But during a raid on the 24th of August, German bombers broke their Führer's orders and the rules of international law when they accidentally dropped bombs on the east end of London. It was an eventuality for which Churchill was well prepared. The previous month, he had written to his Secretary of State for Air,
"In case there is a raid on the centre of government in London, it seems very important to be able to return the compliment the next day upon Berlin."
Yes, everything's okay, sir. Full bang on, is it? Yes, everything's bang on, sir. Right here.
On the 25th of August, on Churchill's orders, and despite the tenets of international law forbidding attacks on cities, the RAF set out on the first of many sorties against the German capital. It was a political act that announced to the Germans that Britain could attack as well as defend. Soon, cities all over Germany were being devastated by bombers like this Lancaster. That Churchill could push through such a bold new policy was down to the recently streamlined command structure he'd created and the extra powers he'd awarded himself. Believing his actions were morally justified, Churchill rode roughshod over the rules of international law. But the Prime Minister's bold move had an unexpected and ultimately favourable consequence. His attack on Berlin enraged the Führer. Incensed, Hitler agreed to a change of tactics.
Wenn die britische Luftwaffe 200, 300, 4.000 Kilogramm Bomben wirft, dann werfen wir jetzt in einer Nacht 150, 180, 230, 300...
The Luftwaffe was ordered to pound industrial cities in an effort to wreck the economy and break civilian morale. The war had reached the home front. Once again, it was Churchill who rallied the spirit of the people with visits to the stricken areas.
He'll patch up your troubles.
But the diversion of the bombing to cities also had its advantages. As Londoners struggled on, vital repairs were being made to the airfields, relieving the pressure on an exhausted fighter command.
Beacon Hill, Squadron 3-2, intercept 4-6.
Knowing that the Germans would be heading for London and the centres of industry also helped the RAF controllers to scramble fighters to break up the Nazi formations. By changing tactics and targets, the Germans had actually helped Fighter Command to manage the raids more effectively.
On Sunday, the 15th of September 1940, Winston Churchill came here to the headquarters of Fighter Command 11 Group. It was this group that was bearing the brunt of the assault from the Luftwaffe. From the gallery here, he could see the table below on which a fierce air battle was being charted.
By the early evening, it had become clear that the RAF had won the day. The victory was so conclusive that it ensured Britain's air superiority and meant that an immediate Nazi invasion was no longer possible. 2 days later, Hitler postponed the whole operation. Britain had survived the greatest threat in her history. Winston Churchill had proved himself the greatest crisis leader of all time.
As in all crises, it took the courage and sacrifice of many ordinary people, but it also took the single most impressive act of leadership of the 20th century. Churchill was the right man for the crisis because the complex strands of history and personality came together at a particular moment. His obstinacy, energy, and ruthlessness meant that he was not well suited for any position besides that of the man in ultimate charge. But in the role of Prime Minister, and when put to the ultimate test, his former weaknesses became his greatest strengths. Should Britain ever again face a crisis on the scale of 1940, let us hope for a leader of the stature of Winston Churchill.
If today your heart is weary, if every little thing looks grand.
For more perspectives on Churchill, plus a chance to listen to his famous speeches, visit the BBC History website, bbc.co.uk/history.
Revealing the secrets of John F. Kennedy next Friday, 9 o'clock, BBC 2.